There we go. All right, Congressman Gallagher, thanks for joining our Stanford class. I think all the students have seen his biography, but Mike's one of the leading thinkers in defense in Congress, both I'd say in the Senate and the House. Mike's got an amazing background, a great Princeton grad, and then went on to serve in the Marine Corps, did a few deployments overseas, and eventually then got his PhD, and now is just reelected to his third term representing Wisconsin. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I should confess my bias, or rather my animus at the beginning towards Stanford, because Stanford was the only school that rejected me when I applied to 5 colleges many years ago. Now, in fairness to Stanford, I basically literally cut and pasted a other application for a different school, and at the last second applied to Stanford. But still, the rejection still stings to this day, and I vowed revenge, and I hope to extract a little bit of that revenge tonight.
Yeah, awesome.
Joe, there goes your funding.
I think I went to a Rose Bowl once with Stanford playing Wisconsin. It was a few years ago, but actually I think Wisconsin won, actually, so I'll just shut up about that. So,
well, Mike, before we get into the heavy policy and electoral questions, it'd be great first to just hear what's life like as a congressman.
Well, it's interesting. I think if you just watch the news, you would think that all of us are consumed with whatever the Twitter controversy of the day is. But I think what I'd like to suggest to the class is that Raj, I think you've seen this up close and personal, is that there is a ton of good work going on beneath the surface, sort of beyond what you see on TV, particularly in the realm of national security, that doesn't get headlines, it doesn't get a lot of attention, but is incredibly important. As a member of the Armed Services Committee in the House, we passed an annual National Defense Authorization Act. It is the culmination of a year's worth of work. Right now, it's still in conference. It's going to be the biggest piece of legislation outside of a Phase 4 coronavirus bill that we pass in the remaining months of this lame duck session of Congress. And at a time when it seems like everything is divided, it does represent an area of significant bipartisanship. And I think when it comes to the big questions of the day, from a defense perspective, from a national security perspective, I sense an emerging, I don't want to call it a bipartisan consensus, but certainly an opportunity to rebuild something resembling that consensus. And so, there's no question that the demands of reelection are very onerous, and you have to do unsavory things like fundraise. And, everyone in Wisconsin is breathing a sigh of relief right now, because when we turn on the TVs, it's no longer attack ads, be they presidential or congressional. But I just bring that up to suggest there's also simultaneously a lot of serious work being done and a lot of serious people trying to do that work. And I'll end just by saying, I think that's the biggest misconception I had coming into this job 4 years ago, which is to say, I thought that the dysfunction in Congress was purely a function of the people that were in Congress. In other words, Congress was just, filled with charlatans or people that were incompetent. Now, certainly there are examples of that, and certainly there's a lot of careerism that goes on. But Congress is also filled with a lot of incredibly smart, patriotic, well-intentioned people with unique backgrounds that just want to serve the country. And I've been blown away by the quality of a lot of my peers on both sides of the aisle. And I think we're seeing a lot of new members emerge, a lot with military backgrounds, a lot with private sector backgrounds. The reason the Democrats were able to take the House in 2018 is that they recruited a lot of really good candidates, and they turned Trump districts in the opposite direction. And we kind of took a page from their book this time. And so you're seeing a new generation emerge, and that's made my life in Congress a lot more enjoyable, and it's allowed us to focus on some serious work.
That's great. And Mike, one of those things that you're doing that's quite serious, and probably one of the better things that came out of Congress last year, was the Future of Defense Task Force. And the students here, as part of their assigned reading, have read your report. Maybe you could give us just an overview of which of the areas and recommendations that you're most excited about and that you want to see get enacted over the next few years.
Well, I think Maybe I could kind of nest it within what's happening right now with the presidential transition. And I'm confident there will be a presidential transition at some point. I think there's a serious debate going on within the Biden national security camp about what direction to go. And there's some serious questions they're going to have to answer early on. And I think it would be a mistake for them to sort of view everything the Trump administration did as tainted, and we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because the fact is, there has been remarkable progress made on U.S.-China competition in particular over the last 3 years. And then I would say technological competition within that space. And for all the criticism of the Trump administration's neglect of allies, the fact is we've recently had some incredibly important diplomatic wins when it comes to convincing the UK, for example, to get on the same page with us with respect to Huawei, shifting the Huawei ZTE 5G debate in certain European countries like Germany. A long way to go, but it does seem like the concerted effort from the executive branch and the legislative branch to send a signal, at least to our closest allies, our Five Eyes allies, that we need to have the same basic principles when it comes to future control of the internet and 5G internet technologies. We've made a ton of progress on that. And that, I think, comes through in the Future of Defense Task Force, how critical it is, at least on 5G, to be in the same position with our allies. But, and this is a big but, I would say for the last 4 years, we've purely been playing defense. In other words, we've been going around the world saying, Huawei's bad, Huawei's bad, ZTE's bad, ZTE's bad. See, look at all this stuff. We're declassifying all this evidence. And then we had a long-form Wall Street Journal investigation of Huawei equipment in African Union countries. And we've just been sending the signal. And that's good. We had to do that. And it required some tough conversations. The next phase of this, I think, involves some sort of offensive-minded effort in concert with our allies in order to cooperate better on these technologies, in order to form something like a digital development fund to coordinate the R&D and the distribution pathways with our like-minded partners. Without reinventing the wheel of existing international efforts, I think America can take the lead by launching a coalition of countries dedicated, to finding coordinated solutions, particularly when it comes to 5G, that can not only compete on quality with Chinese state-owned or sufficiently state-backed enterprises, but also compete on price. And I would say the same goes for our efforts to coordinate with them on a vaccine. And I do think if there's one lingering effect of the coronavirus crisis, it's going to be, and I don't know if we've debated this before, Raj, or should I call you Dr. Shah, since you're a professor here? I don't want to be too familiar with you or suggest that I don't have anything but the utmost respect for you. But I do think that some form of selective economic decoupling from China is inevitable and necessary. And you're going to see efforts to selectively couple when it comes to our capital markets to make sure that if Chinese companies list in U.S. markets, they have to follow the same reporting and transparency requirements as U.S. companies. They're going to see it in key technology areas, not just 5G, but AI, rare earths, medical devices, pharmaceuticals. I think there's going to be a serious effort to reshore manufacturing, or perhaps revitalize Puerto Rico as a hub for manufacturing advanced pharmaceutical ingredients. You're going to see it reflected in a lot of different areas, and I actually think that's an opportunity for some more bipartisanship. So I just bring that up to say, if you look at a lot of the work of the Future of the Defense Task Force, I think some of those issues are actually going to be debated right now by the Biden transition team and the incoming Biden foreign policy team. And I think it would be a mistake for us to go back, given how much progress we've made on U.S.-China competition in general and technological competition in particular, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. In fact, one of the earlier speakers was Bridge Colby, came in and talked about the NDS, and the students have studied it. And of course, historically, politics was supposed to stop at our nation's shores, and and defense was a pretty bipartisan place. So I guess as you look to, or as you think about the transition team, and you're going to, I'm sure, interact a bit with them. What do you think would be the key next steps that they can take to continue the things you talked about, right? So the bipartisan report that you had highlighted 5G very clearly, but now to implement some of those things that you discussed as a whole of nation effort, right? You've got to get the economic side, the Treasury, Commerce, as well as DoD. What do you think the opportunities are there for this administration?
Well, I think the opportunity, maybe I'll start with sort of the economic opportunity. I think, let's say, given Biden's rhetoric on, mending fences with our European allies, there's an obvious opportunity to clean up any lingering disputes with allied countries when it comes to the so-called Section 232 tariffs. These are the tariffs we placed on steel and aluminum. There's actually a fascinating, thesis or dissertation that is waiting to be written about the nature of 232 tariffs and the constitutional problems with Congress giving up its ability to regulate commerce with foreign nations to the executive branch. It created a situation in which the president was able to claim that we face a national security threat from Canadian steel and aluminum and effectively impose a tax on the American people. So if any of you guys are interested in writing about that, there's a lot to be explored there. So resolve 232 disputes. I've opposed them from the start because for the broader picture, I think you can't pick a trade fight with our friends at the same time you're trying to pick a trade fight with China. So you could immediately bring some of our disaffected friends into the fold, particularly if they continue to move in our direction when it comes to 5G, which is probably the most important disagreement we've had with some of our European allies. In fact, I remember going to the Munich Security Conference 2 years ago, and Vice President Pence gave this great speech in which he had a beautiful line. He said something to the effect of, and check me on this, we can't ensure the defense of the West if our allies are dependent on the East. Now, it may have been a reference more towards Germany's Nord Stream pipeline deal with Russia, but to me, it also meant, reliance on China for internet infrastructure. So that's one. Resolve the 232 disputes. At the same time, you maintain pressure on the 301 investigations, which are sort of the investigation into unfair Chinese trade practices. Then I think there's just an obvious slam dunk waiting in the form of a free trade agreement with the UK now that they've navigated their withdrawal from the European Union, as well as a bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan. The reason that the U.S. Trade Representative didn't want to pursue a trade agreement with Taiwan is because they didn't want to screw up the phase one trade deal with China. So there's an economic opportunity for the incoming Biden team. On the hard sort of defense side of the equation, I think it would be a mistake for the incoming Secretary of Defense to, let me put it this way. Whoever the Secretary of Defense is going to face some very difficult budgetary choices. We just spent over $3 trillion on coronavirus response. We're not going to be able to continue a 3% increase in the defense baseline over the next 2 years. So there's going to have to be hard choices. And the biggest and hardest choice they need to make right away is the prioritization among the services. And I think if you look at our national defense strategy, all the things that Bridge Colby talked to you about, you'd probably conclude that if you just look at our priority theater, INDOPACOM, you might notice some interesting things about that theater, notably that there's a lot of water. Therefore, it would make sense to prioritize the Navy and the Air Force and not prioritize growing the Army. That's a huge choice they're going to have to make right away. There's also some huge opportunities they have now that we're no longer bound by the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, meaning we can field a bunch of missile systems in INDOPACOM and allow us to have a bigger impact at lower cost. So there's a set of defense opportunities they have. And then going beyond that, I would say, let's say the Biden administration wants to prioritize environmental issues in the way that the Trump administration did, right? And I think Biden already announced his intent to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. Well, I think it would be a mistake to subordinate our security issues, particularly those with China, to the demands of cooperating with them on environmental issues. However, I think there's room to make a smart investment in carbon capture technology, nuclear microreactor technology. Heck, I have a bill which relates to the kind of grew out of the Future Defense Task Force with Chuck Schumer, Ro Khanna, who represents you guys. I think he's probably your district. He's a very progressive Democrat. And it would be the biggest investment from the federal government in research and development since the end of the Cold War. And a lot of that would be in clean energy technology. So there's, I think, even an opportunity in the environmental space to put forward something that some Republicans could get behind, even though we are unlikely to approve a Green New Deal and likely to continue to criticize the Paris Climate Agreement, and certainly likely to vocally criticize the administration if indeed they choose to go back to the status quo ante of a cooperative or rapprochement approach to China for the sake of climate change cooperation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's
Raj, you have a very nice background, by the way.
No, I know, man. It's Stanford. It's nice out here. It doesn't get cold. It doesn't snow.
Like Wisconsin.
Exactly. I'll ask one more, and then I'll turn it over to the rest of the teaching team. So I'm glad you touched a little bit on budget, right? And that's part of your role there on armed services, and understand, hey, top line is going to be challenged given the other expenditures. How do you think about then the mix and the allocation within, right? So one of the things that this class has really studied is what are the future technologies, AI, autonomy, that is going to impact how we fight war, and what should be our rough balance, right? And proportion, knowing that it's difficult to predict the future. Now, how are you guys going to think about that allocation? Do you think there'll be shifts in there?
Yeah, I think it's it's very hard for Congress to do long-term strategic planning. I mean, we're not optimized as an organization to look beyond 2 years, and sometimes it feels like we're just looking 2 weeks at a time or 2 days. And I do think while it's impossible to predict sort of all of the technologies that would dominate the future, I think if you talk to most younger members of the Armed Services Committee who sort of work on this stuff and pay a little bit more attention to it, I mean, some things are obvious, right? Like, I think everyone agrees that we have to make an increased investment in AI. I mean, the future does look, will inevitably involve a lot more unmanned systems. For example, I work a lot on naval issues. If you think about how we're going to grow the future of the Navy, to me, it's obvious that we're not going to be building, we're not going to be increasing the number of carriers we have from 11/12 to 15. In fact, it'll probably be a glide path down to 9 at some point. And then we'll grow the fleet with smaller ships, i.e. small surface combatants, and then unmanned systems, both large unmanned surface combatants as well as unmanned underwater vessels. And if you look at the Marine Corps Commandant's planning guidance, which I think is actually the most innovative thing that's been written by any military service in the last decade, that's exactly what he's recognizing. He's the only one I've seen so far that's been willing to say, we are not going to invest in certain legacy systems like big amphibious ships that are optimized for doing a joint force entry operation like Marines did back in World War II in the Pacific. And instead, we're going to focus on fielding small teams of Marines who can operate unmanned systems throughout the first and second island chain, having the logistical infrastructure to constantly move them around, to complicate our enemy's decision-making cycle, figuring out the basing agreements with our allied countries so we can host missile systems there, et cetera, et cetera. So I think he kind of gets the mix right. What are some other areas? I think all of this, however, is bound up in a bigger budget discussion. For example, you can scrape together, an extra 50 or 100 million here to invest in robotics and AI and this and hypersonics and all these cool words that politicians just throw into sentences to sound like they know what they're talking about. I use blockchain. I just sort of throw blockchain into a sentence and people are like, oh my gosh.
I'm surprised we hadn't heard that yet.
I know. Yeah, that's right. And then, but if you look at sort of the overall budget changes, what's costing us more and more money is human beings, right? In other words, if you compare the Reagan buildup in the 80s, the heady days of the 600 ship Navy and the defense investment that we're still living off of today, if you compare it in real dollars, so adjusted for inflation, to the Obama cut, you know, the days of the Budget Control Act and sequestration, we spent more money during the Obama 8 years than we did during the Reagan years. And it's not because our ships got more exquisite and fancy, though they did, and that cost money. It's primarily because human beings got more expensive. I mean, and the military has the same problem that the rest of society has, which is a problem of funding healthcare and retirement costs. And that's a very difficult problem to solve. Now, theoretically, unmanned allows you to have a similar impact with less human beings, but you're still going to have a lot of human beings involved in the business of defending the country. So I just bring that up to say, in some ways, the biggest and hardest choices that DoD needs to make actually have nothing to do with cutting edge technology. They have everything to do with healthcare costs and retirement costs and the cost of training human beings and making sure they're ready to fight.
No, makes a lot of sense. Okay, I'm gonna turn it over to Joe for the next question.
Thanks, Raj. Congressman, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for all you're doing for us up there on the Hill. It must be an interesting time to be serving. You know, we had mentioned Bridge Colby and the National Defense Strategy, which we went over within class. And I was actually in OSD policy when Bridge was putting it together. And, you know, we know Secretary Mattis at the time, he took a real personal interest in it. So this was not a partisan document. I really thought it reflected enduring national interests. If it's not too political, I just wonder if you could kind of anticipate, what do you think will change in the next National Defense Strategy, and what do you think should change in the next National Defense Strategy if you had to guess?
That's a great question. I salute you for surviving your time in OSD. Okay, so to kind of go back to something I said before about, I think, two camps within the Biden advisory team. The first is sort of that which I would associate with a return to the Obama era approach, which would probably focus on attempted cooperation with China. And, you know, if you want to cooperate with China, that leads you down a path where you put Taiwan relations on the back burner. You're less likely to press hard against Chinese tech giants like Huawei, and you kind of go out of your way to be on ostensibly good terms with Beijing because you want their cooperation on transnational issues, particularly environmental issues. But if the second sort of more realistic camp wins out, one that looks at the malign activities of, you know, competitor states like China and Russia and focuses on defending American influence and liberal values internationally, I think there will be a striking amount of continuity, if you can believe that. However, of course, and to the point of your question, I think the Biden administration's spin on great power competition will be different from the Trump administration's. That's okay. If the point of departure is about defending our values internationally, as opposed to better competing internationally, which was the Trump administration's core focus in the national security strategy, you're still likely to come down in a similar place in terms of how you approach adversaries like the CCP and Vladimir Putin. And I think the Biden administration will, in particular, have an opportunity when it comes to, you know, placing values at the center of American foreign policy. I think I have Democratic colleagues who are influential in the Biden camp, like Tom Malinowski, who would argue for doing just that. And we've worked very closely on things like calling out what's happening in Xinjiang province, similarly calling out human rights abuses at the hands of Vladimir Putin, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you'll see a movement just on sort of the overall position that values-based arguments play in the national security strategy. Though if you talk to H.R. McMaster, he would say that values were an integral part of the national security strategy. I think, you know, when asked recently, I think Biden said that the top threat to America was Russia. Though I disagree with that, I think that aligns with similar things either he has written in Foreign Affairs or some of his close advisors have written in Foreign Affairs, where they advocate for kind of a Europe-centric approach to U.S. foreign policy. And maybe Bridge Colby would agree with me on, or would disagree with me on this. But I think to the extent they change the overall regional prioritization for our national security strategy and say that European command is the primary and decisive theater and Indo-PACOM is secondary, I think that could happen. I also think it would be a huge mistake because there's absolutely no comparison. I mean, what Bridges' document is asking us to do is to do some form of deterrence by denial in both Indo-PACOM and in European Command against the Russians. But certainly I see a clear priority of China, China, China in that document, and Russia's a distant fourth. And I think there's a chance that the Biden team may either equalize the priority or shift the priority focus to Russia. I would disagree with that, but I could see it happening, if that makes sense.
Sure. No, thank you.
All right, over to Steve.
So welcome, Congressman. It's I think an incredibly rare event that we have someone who's been both in Anbar province in a startup and breakthrough fuels and serving the country in the House Armed Services Committee. So I think that Venn diagram is pretty unique. But given you have that experience of both startups and at the tip of the spear, I want to just ask it'll be a long question, but I think you've seen what happens when startups attack large organizations, existing incumbents that have legacy systems and customers and organizations, et cetera. And often those startups win, not because they're better, but they're faster, they're more agile. And it's not that the companies lose because they didn't have smart people, but because the VP of sales was saying, no, I can't change. I have all this sales organization, I have whatever. And large companies, most of the time, actually go out of business. They get disrupted, and the new entrants replace them. Well, that's what's happening to us in China, at least in my view, is that China doesn't have legacy, or at least they don't have the 75 years of aircraft carriers and everything else. And we're the ones now being disrupted. And so my question is, given you've seen that, the problem in the large organizations, at least appears to me, not just that we don't have the technology or dollars or whatever, but we have all this legacy organization, people, budget, primes, et cetera, who are built into the last system. You're sitting at the center of this, and you've seen all the sides of getting it right and getting it wrong. How do we fix this organizational mindset that says, well, we've been the leader, we'll always be the leader, when you can't even get service chiefs to kind of say, well, draw me what the Chinese are doing and how fast are they moving, rather than show you their latest AI demo. That's nice. In fact, we're going to win the war on demos, but I don't think that we're going to win the war on deployment. So sorry about the soliloquy.
No,
does that make sense as a question?
It totally makes sense. And in some sense, I think, it is the question, right? I mean, we have a very, I would say, brittle defense industrial base because it's highly concentrated. Power and money is highly concentrated among essentially, five or six companies. And as Raj has written about and talked about, Professor Shah, Leader Shah, I think there's only been 2 defense related companies that have, had a valuation north of $1 billion in the last couple of decades, SpaceX and Palantir. That's because we build moats around these industries, and there's a bunch of special interests that advocate for the status quo, and it becomes very hard for Congress to change anything. Now, we've tried in the form of giving special acquisition authority to the services. Honestly, if you look at the U.S. code, when it relates to defense provisions, we actually don't really need to give new authority to the services to allow them to experiment and invest in certain technologies and make bets on small and medium-sized companies. We've given them a ton of authority, but there's a general risk aversion among the services and almost an unholy alliance between the general officer and flag officer class and the primes, because the general officer and the flag officer class, when they retire, then goes and works for the primes and gets paid $1 million a year as a consultant for Boeing or Lockheed. Sorry, no offense if any of you are consultants for Boeing or Lockheed or whatever. So there's almost a swampy aspect to all of this that precludes innovation or just a sort of a risk-taking mindset. The other thing I'd say I don't fully understand now, but I'm thinking about devoting most of the next 2 years to on the Armed Services Committee, is there's an argument that Goldwater-Nichols itself, for those out there who are interested, Victory on the Potomac is a great book to read about sort of the passage of the Goldwater-Nichols Act. One of the legacies of Goldwater Nichols, as I understand it, and I haven't taken a deep dive into it, is that it governs the requirements processes for the services. So, the Navy says, we need to do X, and here's our strategy for doing X, and all these documents go bounce around the Department of the Navy. We kind of need to change that entire process, because the result is the services generate requirements and visions that do not align with the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, or they're just published prior to those documents, or without taking into account changes those documents make. It's a totally incoherent strategy process that doesn't actually drive our budget choices and allows the status quo to win out and legacy systems to dominate. The other thing I do think we need to think about, and where I could use the help of smart people like all of you, is that, okay, so look at my district, right? We have a shipyard in Northeast Wisconsin, Fincantieri Marinette Marine. We built something called the Littoral Combat Ship. The Littoral Combat Ship was supposed to be the ship of the future for the Navy. You can Google Bob Work, LCS. He wrote a great white paper on how the Littoral Combat Ship went awry. And it was really a story of the Navy just getting too ambitious with its requirements, trying to do too much with one ship, constantly changing requirements, which then screwed up the manufacturing of the whole thing, made it extremely complicated. And sometimes I do worry that we get too enamored with the new technology and the next big thing and create these hyper exquisite platforms that are extraordinarily difficult to build, let alone operate and maintain, when sometimes a simpler and sometimes a less technologically advanced approach might do just as good. And indeed, that's why I am so enthusiastic about the opportunities of a post-INF environment, because we can field missile systems that we already have that have ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers that can do things that otherwise would require a destroyer or a big, fancy, expensive ship to do. And that's one way you get more defense at less cost. So that was a long answer to a very complicated question. I had hoped when Raj left the government, he was going to figure out the answer to this question and figure out how we generate a new generation of primes to displace the existing order. But we've given you over a year, Raj. Where are the results?
Next week, man. I got some bills I'm going to send you to get passed.
Can I just add one thing to that, Steve? I don't mean this as a cop out. It is so hard as a member of Congress. Like, I like to think I pay a decent amount of attention to this stuff. I work hard to understand it. I have an academic and a professional background in it, which I think gives me a little bit of an advantage. But I feel like I'm just scratching the surface. I mean, just because there's no time sometimes to really dig in to the bureaucratic labyrinth that is the Pentagon. And so I think a lot of the answer to your question about, why the status quo wins out, why the primes are so good at defending their territory, is just, it's not member of Congress laziness. It's just, you have so many demands on your time and the demands of reelection. It's hard to carve out a half hour of my day to devote to serious defense work just because of the nature of being a member of Congress. And that's a problem, because it's really Congress's role. If you look at the history of some of our autonomous drone systems, Congress was poking the Pentagon to get over their intransigence at the early stages of that. It requires the legislative branch to get in the game to force the Pentagon to do some things it often doesn't want to do.
That's a great answer, Congressman. And Raj, I'll pass it back to you, but I want to share with the Congressman one insight, at least I got from a speaker in our class, which was General Shanahan, who stood up to Jake. And it was really interesting reading between the lines, as he thought his first customer set will be imagery analysts who want to automate their process. It seems obvious that you could use machine learning to identify targets. Turned out those were the last people on Earth who wanted their help because they were worried about losing billets. The people who really grabbed it out of his hand were in SOCOM, because anything at the pointy end that could make them live another day or achieve the mission was actually wanted rather than keep it out of our building. And I think you might want to ponder is that innovation tends to occur at the edges and then moves to the center of any large organization. And we should probably think about how do we incent both the edges to not disappear, like the ref disappeared and SDA is going to get subsumed, etc. Instead, take their best practices and move them in. And apologies for the advertisement. Raj, back to you.
But Raj,
Oh,
I'm sorry. I gotta jump in on that. And I don't know, Shanahan might disagree, but from my perspective, the only reason the Jake exists or Maven exists or any of those associated programs exists is because there was a bullheaded and enterprising Marine colonel who shall remain nameless on this discussion since it's being recorded, who was literally just doing movement to contact in the Pentagon, running through bureaucratic brick walls with little regard for his own career in order to make it happen. And it was very much kind of a John Boyd story that needs to be told that hasn't been told yet. And I think it actually, I mean, it's the exception that proves the rule. It just required people like that being willing to risk their own careers in order to do the right thing to get any progress on that issue.
Yeah, it's going to be an amazing story what they've accomplished. And and candidly, there's Congress is hard. You guys have a lot of demands on your time, but I will say, Mike, you and your colleagues on the future of defense have spent the time to put together a really cogent view that's bipartisan, which we haven't seen in a long time. And so, much credit to you guys. Okay, we're going to do two quick student questions, and then we're going to turn it over to the presentation. So I think I only see two. So we'll go first to Janani and then Sienna.
And he did mention Drew Cooker, Congressman.
Okay, good. Well, that's who I was talking about. So
I know.
I worked for Cooker in a past life.
Yeah.
I wanted to get that on the record just so he gets the gets his name heard twice.
He's an unsung hero.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
All right, John, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to answer our question. So my question had to do with the recent news regarding Esper. I was wondering if you think that the president's decision to terminate Esper will influence or change his defense strategy over his final months of the administration.
Well, first of all, is that a fake background or a real background that you have?
Fake.
Okay, I was going to say, you have an incredibly nice apartment. And
I'm just really good at it.
That's a Stanford dorm room, actually, I think. Just a regular dorm.
Well, first let me say I was taken off guard by the move. I mean, I had expected that, Esper would be removed in a second Trump term because it was, there seemed to be antipathy between the White House and Esper. And I don't know if that's a function of some of the disagreements over Confederate base naming or the use of federal troops during some of the riots in DC, but whatever it was, it seemed like the relationship had soured. I don't understand why you would remove him with, 2 months to go before a transition. I don't know how it helps your cause. And so I really don't know what's behind it other than maybe trying to prove a point. I didn't feel like Esper was a member of the team. I always had great dealings with Esper, and I think he was sincere in what he stated repeatedly was his top priority, which is implementing the national defense strategy and forcing the Pentagon bureaucracy to abide by the priorities of the national defense strategy. And that's a noble goal, and it was one that served the president's interest. And that beside, I had disagreements with Esper about kind of, I'm a navalist and I want a bigger and modern Navy, and I'm not as keen on growing the Army, but he was always very forthcoming in his dealings with Congress. So I don't understand it, how it will affect our defense posture over the next 2 months. I hope it doesn't. I hope no adversary is sort of thinking about this as a way to take advantage of us during a transition. I think and would hope that the uniformed military is prepared for a lot of the dumb things that some of our adversaries could try and do, particularly as America seems to be internally divided. But having been very surprised by the move, I don't know how it's going to play out over the next 2 months, and I don't fully understand it. And I haven't talked to anybody in the White House in the last 4 days to try and understand it.
Got it.
Sorry, that was not a cop-out. That's just my honest sense.
It's good, Frank. All right, we'll go to Sienna for the last one, and then we'll go to the presentation.
Yes, I just had a quick question on, you mentioned how it's very difficult to change the status quo in Congress. And my question is in particular about how do we stop special interest groups in the military industrial complex from influencing Congress to make decisions that are perhaps better for business but maintain the status quo rather than making decisions based on innovation and national security?
Well, it's a great question. I think, well, two answers, and I'm not sure your instructors would agree with this, so take them with a grain of salt. One, I think it does fundamentally come down to the way in which the Pentagon awards money. And you have people, and I'm stealing from Raj here, Raj and Paul Morlucky and a lot of others who have written extensively about the need for the Pentagon to stop making sort of very small and insignificant bets on a variety of different companies that can never make that next step to becoming, a prime, or go from a small or mid-sized company to a prime, to making bigger bets on a smaller subset of non-prime companies. So that's one way in which I think you could start to get less of a kind of military industrial complex culture. The second is, I wonder if there's not some sort of ethics reform or drain the swamp proposal that could be applied to the Pentagon without unleashing some unintended consequences. So, for example, I've long thought it's a good idea for members of Congress to be prohibited from lobbying for the industries that they oversee in Congress. I prefer for a lifetime, but I'd take 5 years. That seems like a sensible drain the swamp proposal that both myself and Ro Khanna in your neck of the woods and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez could get behind. And I wonder if you couldn't have a similar prohibition when it comes to general officers and flag officers, or at least extend the cooling off period so they can't immediately go and collect a paycheck for some of these from some of these companies. Now, that may sound naive and populist to some of your more cultured teachers, but you got to do something about it at the end of the day. Otherwise, you won't get any change. And then maybe I'll just add a third. I thought the biggest problem I saw when I was in the military is really the best and brightest officers of my generation, myself excluded, left usually at the 03 level. In part, just it wasn't a pay thing. It wasn't that they wanted to go to GSB and then make a bunch of money doing venture capital in Silicon Valley. It was more of a flexibility thing. They wanted the Marine Corps to meet them halfway in terms of, hey, can I pursue civilian grad school and I'll pay the Marine Corps back on the back end, and I don't want to have to spend a year at expeditionary warfare school because it doesn't make any sense to me. And it was just more of a career flexibility and management thing. And I think this is something we grappled with extensively on the Future Defense Task Force and on the Cyber Solarium Task Force I co-chaired with Senator Angus King. It's how do you retain the best and the brightest? How do you attract the best and the brightest? And here's another area where we actually have given the Pentagon enormous latitude to reach into private industry and make somebody a colonel or a lieutenant colonel if they have the appropriate skill set. And they really have been loath to use that authority. And to me, that fits in with your question, because I think if you retain qualified officers and enlisted military service members throughout their career, I think you'll start to get more innovative thinking at the top ranks when they become field grade officers and when they become general grade officers, and you'll have less of these sort of status quo military industrial complex.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share your thoughts and experience with this class. And more importantly, thanks for all that you're doing in Congress. As I tell my friends, Mike's one of the good guys there and on the Hill, and we'd be so lucky to have more folks like him in service.
Are you taking any mail-in votes to Wisconsin from California?
I'm happy to take them. I got 2 votes for president out of a possible 330 million people. So I don't know what that percentage is, but hey, it's non-zero. It's a non-zero amount. But thank you guys so much for letting me join you. If I can be helpful to any of you as you consider kind of your next steps, either in the policy world or in politics, I'd be happy to do that. I profited from the advice and mentorship of a lot of people, including your professor, Raj Shah. So happy to pay that forward. And I don't know, I was where you guys were a few years ago, just slogging it out in grad school. And you know, you never know when you're going to be the person making big decisions, whether it's a legislator or a member of the executive branch. I remember my first week on the job as a staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 2013, if memory serves, was the week after Bashar al-Assad gassed his own people in East Ghouta in Syria. And all of a sudden, we were going to do an authorization for the use of military force to strike Syria. And I was the new Middle East specialist on the committee. And the chairman of the committee, or then the ranking member, Senator Bob Corker, came into my office and said, "Hey, Gallagher, you have to write an authorization for the use of military force in Syria." And so I literally Googled AUMF, and, you know, it's one of those moments in life where you pull back the wizard's curtain and not only is no one there, but you're the wizard. And so I just would encourage you guys to keep pursuing a career in policy. You'll find yourself in a position where you can make a real impact very quickly. And if you can write well, and if you can work well with others, you have limitless potential. So really appreciate spending some time with you. It means a lot.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much.